Hello and welcome back. I'm going to continue on with our discussion about how hormones actually lead to effects, responses that take place in target cells by talking about how steroid type hormones accomplish those types of things. So let's see. Get my little pen up here. Come on. Behave. All right, steroid type hormones. And as I mentioned on the last video clip, I probably could have just as easily entitled this lecture hydrophobic type hormones. Most of those are steroid type hormones, but keep in mind that your thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, that you'll learn about in more detail later in this unit, are also hydrophobic, and so they exert their effects on target cells in a similar way to the steroid hormones. Most of your true steroid type hormones are, as I mentioned briefly on the previous video clip, they're derived from cholesterol. Cholesterol looks like this. We saw this on the last video clip. It is a hydrophobic type lipid molecule, so it loves fats, doesn't like the watery-based fluids inside and outside cells. It is actually itself present in the plasma membranes of your cells. It's a vital, very important component of your membranes for them to be able to function properly. And then endocrine glands that produce steroid-type hormones take these molecules and make little modifications or changes to them to produce hormones, such as here's what testosterone looks like, here's what estrogen, the female sex hormone, looks like. And you can see, if you just kind of casually look at the chemical structures of these two versus cholesterol, you can see that they're fairly similar. There have just been some atoms removed and additional things added to make those types of hormones. Okay, on the last video clip, we talked about how hydrophilic non-steroid hormones, they can't diffuse across a cell membrane because they're blocked by that hydrophobic barrier there. So they bind to cell surface receptors, which then leads to a cascade of events that causes a response on the inside of the cell. And that response requires that a second messenger, a second chemical messenger, be triggered on the inside of the cell. This doesn't happen with steroid type hormones or your thyroid hormones, because they're able to diffuse across the cell membrane, and so their receptors are actually not at the surface of the cell, they're actually inside the cell. And those are called intracellular receptors. Okay, so how does this happen? We're going to have to dig back into some of the previous things that you have learned about protein synthesis back in Biology 201. And you may not have studied this in any great gory detail, and we're not going to study it here in any great gory detail, but I am going to remind you about the relationship between the genes on your DNA molecules and your chromosomes and the nuclei of your cells, the relationship between those to proteins that cells make, because that is critical for understanding how these steroid hormones act, and your thyroid hormones as well. So this diagram is showing you a steroid type hormone, so that might be testosterone, for example, or cortisol made by your adrenal glands as a steroid type hormone. So this is a cell, and that hormone is diffusing across the cell membrane to the inside of the cell. Inside the cell has these receptor proteins, these intracellular receptors floating around in the cytosol, waiting to bind the hormone if it happens to diffuse in. Not all cells will make these. Only cells that are true target cells of a particular hormone will have these intracellular receptors. Other cells in your body that are not supposed to respond to this particular hormone will not make those receptor proteins. They won't have those floating around inside the cells. So yeah, these steroid hormones they'll diffuse inside all of the cells in your body, but they don't do anything unless the receptor proteins are there. It's kind of like you have a key that comes into the cell, but there's no ignition to start the engine of the responses that will take place. Okay, so if a cell has the intracellular receptor, hormones that come into the cell bind to these receptors, and then what happens is these receptor hormone complexes go inside the nucleus of the target cell, and they bind to DNA. Okay, so they bind next to or just ahead of particular genes on the DNA molecules. Okay, so hopefully you remember from previous biology classes, you guys know that DNA molecules are chains of these AG, CT, DNA nucleotides, long chains. And along those long chains, you have certain regions that function as genes, certain addresses along the molecule that are genes. And all genes really are blueprints or codes, instructions that tell the cell how to make particular proteins. What these hormone receptor complexes do is they switch on particular genes. Okay, so your cells, the DNA inside all of your cells has approximately 25 to 30,000 different genes located there. Some cells, if you think about your DNA, your chromosomes as being big recipe books, genes are like particular individual recipes that tell your cells how to make particular proteins that have important functions. Not all of your cells use the same recipes all of the time. What a hormone receptor complex will do, it will act as a switch that tells the target cell to start using one or more recipes or genes that it wasn't using before. Okay, so hopefully you guys learned in the past that a gene on a DNA molecule, before that blueprint, those instructions can be used to tell the cell how to make a particular protein, it has to be copied first. The instructions are copied onto a messenger RNA type molecule. And that's what they're showing you here. mRNA is an abbreviation for messenger RNA. That is a chemical copy of a particular gene. That copy is made if the hormone receptor complex attaches to the DNA just ahead of where that gene is located. That's called transcription. Okay? That's transcription. And then when these messenger RNA molecules are made, ribosomes will bind to them like they're showing you here. These little pinkish structures that you see here are attached to the messenger RNA there. They slide along. They read the chemical code on that messenger RNA molecule, and that tells it how to build a new protein. Tells it which proteins are built from amino acids. You have 20 different types of amino acids in your cells that can be put together in various combinations and various lengths, and those are used to build different types of proteins. Okay, and then these new proteins that the cell is making that it didn't make before, proteins are your chemical workhorses in cells. They have many different functions. Many of them are enzymes, for example. If a cell is making new proteins, it's going to do things that it wasn't doing before. Those things that it's now doing are the responses that were triggered by the hormone. Okay, so just like what we saw with the non-steroid hormones, the hormone binding to its very specific receptor ultimately leads to these various responses that a cell can make. Okay, if you want to know a little bit more, or you want a refresher on this DNA to RNA to protein story. There's a really good website that's linked down here at the bottom called the Learn Genetics website, which was put together by the University of Utah. It's not overly complicated. It's very understandable, and it may help you put some of this kind of abstract information together and how you go from, what is a gene on DNA, and how do you go from that to a cell making a particular type of protein. Don't spend a lot of time stressing out over those particular details, but if you do want a refresher and you want to understand some more about it, this Learn Genetics website is excellent for that. All right, thank you very much. That's going to conclude this particular video lecture. I think I will be seeing you next in Unit 3 when we start talking about the reproductive system.